My name's Adam. I'm a member of Spring. My pronouns are they and them, and I'm going to be going over sort of like the what we call the scientific definition of fascism, which is really like kind of like the first definition as it emerges in the 1920s and 1930s from socialists. When I was rehearsing this talk the other day, I accidentally said the sentence, "What we as fascists need to understand about socialism." So if I just get through it without making that mistake, then it's a good talk, I think. But regardless, this is, in as much as like the three of us are sitting up here, can be considered experts, really we envision this panel as being a discussion with everybody in this room. I think everybody in this room, by virtue of being politically engaged and having organizing experience, has a claim to be an expert on fascism and an expert on fighting fascism. So the three of us up here, we want to offer certain guidelines and guideposts to, sort of kick off a discussion. But ultimately, we see this as all of us in this room, we're all experts discussing fascism, what it is, how to fight it. We are socialists discussing fascism, is what we are. So onto the scientific definition of fascism, and I didn't know this when I first took on this topic, but fascism sort of first arises as a term coming from socialists like Clara Zetkin and Leon Trotsky, who were observing Mussolini's rise to power in Italy in the 1920s, which becomes sort of like the first official case, quote unquote, of a fascist government. And that's not to say that there aren't regimes before Mussolini that we might properly describe as such, but that this sort of becomes like the case study, as it were, like ground zero of fascism, I suppose, in a sense. And so in the 1920s and 30s, socialists are trying to develop a framework to understand Mussolini's government, and they're trying to ask the question, is Mussolini's government, is this fascist government different from other forms of government? And what is it that makes it different? And throughout the 1930s, this question starts picking up urgency as Hitler starts rising to power in Germany. So when folks are writing about fascism, there's a real urgency to what it is that they're discussing. And so because of that historical kind of context out of which the definition of fascism arises, I just want to be clear that the framework as I'm about to present it in my section of the talk, it is going to be limited by that context. I mean, we have had 100 years since Trotsky and Zetkin and others started writing about this. We have the benefit of 100 years of development, of theory, of new experiences. Certainly there have been a multitude of ways of developing the theory of fascism and the definition, especially from racialized Marxists going through revolution and contending with fascism in the global South. And these are really invaluable contributions to the theory of fascism that cannot be taken lightly. And so that is not going to be in sort of like my section of the talk, but I'd really like to hear, how we discuss it together as well. You'll also see that perhaps this framework doesn't apply very cleanly to present day, and we'll hear more on that from Josh, I think, who's going to take us through fascism in today's world. And I think also this classical definition of fascism that arises, it sort of leaves us with questions about things, other kinds of oppression that don't necessarily fit cleanly into the framework at first. So things like settler colonialism, for example. And so the purpose of learning this definition isn't to stick to it in a prescriptivist fashion and say, well, such and such is fascist because it fits these criteria, and such is not fascist because it doesn't, it's just sparkling authoritarianism or whatever. There are a lot of things that, like, through this definition, we might not necessarily term fascist in, like, the Trotskyist, Zetkinist sense, but nevertheless, just because they fall outside of this framework, it doesn't undermine the urgency with which we need to tackle them. There are a lot of things that are going to fall outside of this definition that are nevertheless atrocities, and we need to be organizing to stamp those out just as seriously and just as urgently. But nevertheless, we do have to start somewhere when we're talking about fascism, so I'm going to start here, and I'm going to let Suzanne and Josh do the very easy light work of taking us up to speed over the last 100 years. And so I want to get back to that question that, the socialists are initially trying to answer with fascism about, why is it important to make a distinction between a fascist government and a not fascist government if we've already admitted there are a lot of things that aren't fascist that are still terrible. And so as Hitler's rising to power, there's a real debate going on among the left, and it's a debate that has a lot of real world consequences. And basically, while Trotsky and Zetkin and the like hold this view that fascism is its own sort of special thing with special characteristics, you have folks like Joseph Stalin and his followers who are more of the mindset that fascism is not necessarily distinct from capitalism. It's more of the outgrowth of capitalism. And so that leads to all sorts of conclusions as Hitler's rising to power. The first is that it's not necessarily, as urgent perhaps to stop this one guy, because if everything is fascism, then like it doesn't really matter who's in power. It's all fascism. Why pull out all the stops here? And then if you see all of capitalism as fascism, you see everybody to the right of you as being fascist. So for Stalinists and folks, they would look at the social democrats who believe in certain principles of capitalism, aren't necessarily like ready to overthrow the whole thing. And when the time comes for them to build a united front together, they kind of look at them and they go, well, you're fascists too. You're fascists of a different nature. There's no point, we can't build a united front with fascists to fight fascism. And so when the time comes to build that kind of mass movement to defeat fascism, there's a real resistance on the part of some folks. And ultimately, this has horrendous consequences in terms of 1930s Germany. And Suzanne will talk more about that. And just like it would have benefited us to have a cohesive definition of fascism back then, it's still important for us now so that we can have kind of a more limited, precise definition that we can deploy where it's necessary and where it helps us now, where it's useful. There are a lot of things that we call fascism, from like your boss to a specific policy to people that you know. But ultimately, once we have one definition that we can nail down, it just helps us cut through some of the noise a little bit. And it helps us understand, what's going wrong, how it's going wrong, maybe how existentially worried we should be about what's going wrong, and most importantly, what tools we can deploy to defeat it. With all of the qualifications, now onto the scientific definition of fascism. So Trotsky and folks sort of saw fascism as a form of government that is given power through a mass movement from below and through organized violence, and it aims to smash all worker democracy. It aims to smash all the trade unions, all the worker associations, everywhere where workers are consolidating power. And when I say smashing these institutions, I mean like liquidating them. Like I mean that like in Mussolini's Italy, organized street gangs in support of fascist rule, they were going out and they were beating trade unionists. They were killing trade unionists in the streets. They were opening fire on people. They were burning down trade union offices. The goal was not just to hurt the unions, it was to completely destroy them and end them, wipe them off the face of the earth. And so once all these sources of worker power are smashed, there is no opposition, and the government is now in full control of every institution. They have control of the military, they have control of education, and there is no sort of like popular opposition to any sort of atrocity that they want to carry out now that they have this power. And to Trotsky, it matters a little less what a government does once it has this power. Like, there's no sort of like policy or something that like you enact it and it's like, oh, you're a fascist government now. It's more about sort of like this process through which a government gains power that makes a government fascist. And it's kind of like the way that it comes to power sort of matters the most. And it's important that fascism is given power by a broad mass movement from below, and there's sort of a set of conditions that socialists in the 20s and 30s are thinking about how that comes to be. And it starts in this formulation with economic crisis and sort of the way that people's material conditions are affected. As socialists, we know that capitalism is sort of always in crisis. It has its booms and its busts. Capitalism sees itself as infinitely sustainable, capable of growing all the time. We know that's not true. It's going to have down periods. And when it has down periods, people's material conditions are affected, and that affects how they're living their lives. And so once this economic crisis happens, you have a lot of disillusionment and fear. And especially you have a lot of that from the petty bourgeois and the people in the middle classes, aspiring members of the ruling class, like small-time landlords and like small business owners and the like. Because the workers, we have worker-led, like working class solutions to things, but these folks in the middle, they're kind of caught between, hating big business, and they're resentful and they're hateful and envious of big business who they see as screwing them over all the time. But, there is a chance for them to become aligned with workers, but as we'll see, when the working class sort of steps up and fails to emancipate itself, that's when this big middle section of people, they become really disillusioned with sort of like what worker power can achieve, and they turn towards force as the way of sort of like repairing their material conditions, and they see it as the solution to what's hurting them. And so in Italy, once we had this period of economic crisis, the Italian workers seized the factories, and I think Trotsky said we were one step away from a true dictatorship of the proletariat. And then for various reasons that Trotsky goes at length about, and I don't have time to do today, the workers are ultimately defeated. And Trotsky blames that a lot on the reformists, but in essence what ends up happening is the petty bourgeois, they've now seen the workers try to take power, and they've seen it fail, and they're back to square one. So to them, they don't really see worker and working class solutions as solutions to anything. And Trotsky wrote that the despairing petty bourgeois sees in fascism, above all, a fighting force against big capital, and believes that, unlike the working class parties, which deal only in words, fascism will use force to establish more justice. And once you have this big group of people that is really wound up, you have a powder keg, and all it takes is a spark to set it off. And this is usually when we see a person or a party come forward, and they start to unify and mobilize this middle section. And so, Trotsky's observation was that happens a lot through nationalism, through sort of this idea of we need to turn things back to when we were a strong Italy, and it creates this sort of mythology of the way things used to be in the good old days. And what this does is it unifies workers around a common cause and around a common enemy. And that's how it foments hate, and it whips up all kinds of xenophobia and hostility to outsiders and hostility to workers who are trying to change things. You become antithetical to change. And once you have people who are bought in to that, who see that as the enemy, that's when you start to see, things like roving street gangs and this kind of extra legal violence, because once they're all worked up and ready to do something about it, all you need is someone to give them something to do about it. And this is very important to Trotsky, because a key part of what separates fascism from other states of affairs is that it's not necessarily the government doing the killing, it's the people. It's not the government versus the people versus the army, it's the people versus the people. So in Italy, they had the black shirts who were just roving gangs of folks who weren't putting on government uniforms, but were going out, intimidating, harassing, and killing trade unionists. They're quelling dissent through force, basically. And then once you have that, who's going to oppose Mussolini when there's nobody left to oppose Mussolini? They say, first they came for the trade unionists, the socialists, etc. And so once you have all those worker associations eradicated, there is nothing left but for a fascist government to swoop in and take control of things. And on that cheery note, I'm going to pass it over to Suzanne.
Thank you, Comrade, for kicking off the discussion that we're having here so capably and wonderfully. I'm very grateful. So, for my portion of the talk, I'm going to be addressing a few different things. I am going to be mostly focusing on the rise of fascism in Germany in the early 30s. And I'm going to be talking about the German left and the failure to beat fascism in that period. But in order to sort of pivot away from, I don't want us to dwell on what was a catastrophic failure of revolutionaries and leftists, because there are positive examples elsewhere of when revolutionaries, socialist workers did defeat fascism. And I'll end the talk on a positive note with some of those anecdotes. But just to preface this, the history that I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to address in some very broad swaths. The struggle against fascism in Germany during this time period is it's consequential for us as socialists, for so many reasons, for reasons that are extremely obvious to everyone, in terms of sort of the world catastrophic, turn of events that Nazi Germany took. But also because as socialists, a lot of our ideas about struggle and how we advance our struggle and how we fight against reactionary and fascist forces, it really did come out of this time period and this location. And so it is really incumbent on us to take heed of some of the lessons, because it's a period of time that I think, certainly the Canadian state works to advance a certain understanding of these events. And it's our responsibility, though, to emphasize, and when we look at history, what are workers and people's movements doing to address the conditions that they're living in. So anyway, without further ado, to move on in my talk, the rise of fascism in Germany. To contextualize this a bit, Germany's fascist movement in Weimar Germany, in the republic that existed in the interwar years, was the fascist movement was very marginal prior to the 1929 economic crisis. In electoral terms, it would get less than 3% of the vote in the 1928 federal elections. There was definitely some street fighting throughout the 20s, attacking communists and attacking Jews. But for the most part, folks on the left were able to deal very capably and put down some of these pieces of violence when they arose. So to set the stage a little bit, so in 1919, there was the November Revolution, which was an uprising, a very key uprising of workers and soldiers as a result of the massive economic impacts of the First World War. And this uprising brought down the German Empire quite dramatically. And there was something of a power struggle to establish what exactly would be the character of the republic, but a parliamentary republic was established, and the German Social Democratic Party, came out as a very powerful force in this time. And there was also, in another part of the struggle, there was an effort to establish a more Soviet-style council republic, but the result of this was that it was a parliamentary republic, and while there were some social reforms that were achieved, the overall capitalist property relations were left intact. So it was a massive moment of workers' power, but also one where a lot of the living conditions weren't really addressed or fixed for a lot of workers. Now, the immediate years after this uprising did have kind of a lot of political and monetary instability, but a lot of that kind of became smoothed over by 1924, and this was a period, where the fascists were still trying to, build some support, but they didn't really get a whole lot of traction among the German working class. But the dynamic did change when the 1929 economic crisis hit. Unemployment ballooned from about 1.2 million to over 6 million, and suffering was very widespread in this period. But that didn't necessarily change the fact that the workers' movements, from the trade unions and the SPD, the Social Democrats, which was the largest workers' party, which I will talk more about later, combined with the most powerful communist party outside of the Soviet Union at the time. The left had considerable influence and sort of presence in civil society, and so this is sort of part of the fascists' lack of success up until then to achieve much of anything. But anyway, During this period, the German ruling class, different sections of the military, Prussian landowners, and also like the capitalists, the captains of industry, folks who don't necessarily all sort of share the same ideas, but they're very interested in breaking this powerful, very class-conscious working class. And they started to see the Nazis as a force that could be used against the working class. But for this next little bit, I'll talk a bit more about the German left. And in some ways, it's hard for me to wrap my head around a left that is so powerful and established and institutionalized as this left was. In our neoliberal era, it's hard to think of what that could even look like. But as I mentioned before, the SPD, the Social Democrat Party, which I might refer to here on in as socialists or social democrats, and sort of like I'll try to keep myself straight on whether I'm referring to SPD or KPD, the communists. There were more groups, but for simplicity's sake, I'll focus on those two. But for the Social Democrats, their main orientation was the state apparatus that was established out of the 1918-1919 revolution, and defending the state from its opponents from both the right and the left. The KPD, the Communist Party, and they were established, out of that same time period of revolution in 1919. This was the party that was co-founded by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. And they were a smaller force in electoral terms than the SPD, but they were regularly polling 10 to 15% support of the electorate. And so going to 1920, there was a reactionary coup against the new republic, waged by monarchist and right-wing forces, and the workers' movement. Mobilized in a massive nationwide general strike to reverse the coup that reactionary military officers had attempted. Like this coup, as an example, was like one of the first times that the swastika was flown. It predated a lot of the fascist stuff that was later to come, but it was a bit of a prelude to it, and this was an example of how. Because the workers' movement was strong, and because they mobilized from below to reverse the coup in a really massive general strike, they managed to defeat the right at this particular moment. But anyway, fast forward to 1928. Just to set the stage a little bit for the time immediately prior to the economic crisis, there was a coalition government in place in which the Social Democrats were a junior partner with some conservative elements to form a right-wing government. And when the economic crisis hit, this coalition government brought in some very harsh austerity measures, and workers really suffered once again. But for the SPD was very much oriented towards and married to sort of the state and parliamentarism and legalism. And so, the SPD was very much not interested in mobilizing workers in workplace struggles or in anything broader in order to counter these austerity measures. And this was something that really undermined the credibility of the SPD to many workers, and it did eventually. It was one of the things that really started driving people into the arms of the Nazis. And the pace of the events at this point are going pretty quickly. So, fast forward a few years, when Hitler was installed as chancellor in 1933. The SA, which was the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, and together with the SS, were given official powers and were really, before they were kind of minor street fighting level organizations that didn't really have the power to confront, the fighting wings of both the SPD and the KPD. But, once they were given official powers and, and the Nazis started consolidating power, things happened pretty quickly. Earlier that year, the trade unions that same year were disbanded, and the SPD was banned that same year. Nazi thugs, earlier that year, they stormed and shut down the KPD headquarters. And they also used the fire that burned down the German Parliament was used by the Nazis to claim that communists were planning an uprising. There was a mass arrest of 1,500 communists, and at that time, getting note to wrap up. So at that time, this was used as the thing that led to the creation of concentration camp infrastructure in order to house all of the political prisoners. And if I can just have a minute to say what should have happened. So there's a lot of whataboutism when we're talking about history, but one key thing that could have made things turn out differently would have been the formation of a united front between the Social Democrats and the Communists. And just to define united front, from the Communist International definition, it is simply an initiative where the Communists propose to join with all workers belonging to other parties and groups and unaligned workers in a common struggle to defend the immediate basic interests of the workers against the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, in this case, had already thrown their lot in with the Nazis, so it should have been clear who they needed to fight against. And it was, the SPD would have needed pressure from the KPD to join in such an alliance. The onus was on the communists to apply their methods to convince the SPD to join in. But sectarianism won out. For the KPD, a big question within the party was whether to struggle against the SPD, the ones against the state, or to initiate a series of united fronts. And the internal dynamics of the KPD were undergoing some changes during the 20s, but eventually the KPD, in a consultation with Stalin, agreed upon an ultra-left approach that was declared the Social Democrats to be social fascists, basically equivalent to the Nazis. And so, this was an example of very irresponsible application of, calling your any and all opponents or people to your right fascists. KPD membership did grow during this period. They were the ones that fought hardest against the Nazis, but they did not have the strength and numbers that they needed from a united front. And so not having that structure in place, not having that agreement in place, I think really set things up for failure, unfortunately. And I won't get, because I'm stretched for time, I won't get too much into the success stories, but I will say many other countries during that time period, their workers' movements actually successfully, in most cases, dealt with their fascist movements. I recommend looking at the Battle of Cable Street and defeat of the British Union of Fascists in the 30s. I also recommend, fast forward a couple of decades, looking into the history of the Anti-Nazi League, founded in Britain in the 1970s to fight against, the very viciously racist and fascist United Front and its associated organizations. You can look up, one particularly important event was the Battle of Wood Green in 1977. Jeremy Corbyn makes an appearance as one of the co-organizers. And I think I like these events because it does show that, when we apply our methods, when we engage in struggle from below, when we show workers that, socialists, that revolutionaries can address the conditions that we're struggling in, that we have the answers for how we how we advance our interests, then we're able to, cut the fascists off, and not allow them to grow and attract attention. But to talk a little bit more about, things in present day, I'll hand things over to Josh.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I'll be picking up pretty much directly off the back of that, actually, and talking about fascism today. Where is it? What is it? How do we fight it? I think firstly we need to be clear that there are self-identified fascists, right off the bat. There are people who call themselves Nazis and they identify as such, and we should by no means, sorry, I'm just gonna, yeah, we should by no means should we downplay the importance of that. However, I think the big question facing us today is, are the growing forms of far-right populism that are having success in the electoral space, are they fascist? Is Meloni a fascist? Is Le Pen a fascist? Is Trump a fascist? And there's some debate with scholars around this about how to approach it. I think as Adam mentioned, up top is some say that making a very strict comparison is difficult, and that due to different material conditions between then and now, the populist far right are kind of fundamentally different today, and it would be a lot harder for fascists to gain true power. And this doesn't mean fascists can't occur today, but it makes it somewhat more unlikely. However, there are other thinkers, I'm thinking people like Alberto Toscano, Robert Paxton, who argue that it's important to cast a much wider net, so to speak, and identify at least some of the main moods, ideas, and themes that may or may not be re-emerging in the modern context. And in this way, we can call out fascism as it occurs. And in this way, our task is really, how do we give fascism a precise enough definition that we can distinguish it from other isms, like capitalism, liberalism, socialism, but also a broad enough definition that we can identify newer forms of fascism that may be occurring. Because the danger is really, if we can only define something in retrospect, then we can't battle it before it occurs, And overall, that requires, an understanding of the history, the context, and that's why we're doing the talk today, right? So yeah, as we said, just in brief, Nazis came to power because the capitalist classes brought them to power. They did this primarily to smash workers' movements, and it's only through a mass movement that this could be achieved. And in that way, fascism is first and foremost a counter-revolutionary mass movement from below that aims at the complete destruction of working-class organizations, trade unions, and the left. So it's not just a police state, it's a mass movement. And capitalists judge the risk of losing control of the entire state apparatus to be worth it in their goal of smashing the left and smashing any resistance, right? So where are we today? Obviously, there's a crisis in capitalism. Multiple right-wing populist parties making significant progress in Europe, a potential Trump presidency coming back, demonization of migrants, rising Islamophobia, far-right riots on the streets of the UK just recently, the rise of authoritarian leaders, But is this fascist? Is this fascist? To take strict argument from an analogy, as I've said, some argue that mainstream right-wing populists are not actually fascists, and that's not to underplay their danger. In many cases, these right-wing populists have actually taken on the project of the liberal state. So Giorgia Meloni in Italy, they're a party literally descended from fascists. That's where the roots of the party are. But they've kind of found a winning formula of having this very pro-EU consensus, pro-market agenda, but still, very socially conservative, anti-migrant rhetoric, and racist, but in kind of a covert way, using dog whistles. It's kind of sneaky. We don't have the same material conditions in terms of a mass armed population that could facilitate the kind of paramilitary movements that we saw in the 30s. And this mass movement is necessary if it's going to be called fascist, and if it is a complete destruction of the working class. And in this way, some thinkers, they argue that it's not possible today. States are more democratically minded, we're more democratically minded, and even the conservative leaders will be much less willing to give up their control of the state apparatus in the same way. And that's not to say it's impossible, but it's maybe more unlikely. However, I think this thinking might be somewhat strict. So, these far-right movements, they do have fascist roots, as I've said, and they do have fascist figures, and they do have fascist ideas, and they do have fascist allies. At best, the far right today is creating a space in which fascist ideas become more legitimized. At worst, they're incubating fascist ideas and laying the groundwork for future fascism, making a fascist future more likely. The ground for fascist movements in the 30s was laid by the people who supported them, but also by the center and the liberals. And today, this is kind of what we're seeing, an intensification of the border by the center, Islamophobia, increased police powers on protest. This all creates environments in which fascist ideas and the far right can feed off and thrive. We've seen the willingness of the liberal state in lots of contexts, and I'm thinking primarily Europe, but in lots of other contexts to, compromise with the far right and the populists to win back votes. This is because the liberal center and the conservatives are in a period of crisis. They're losing votes. No one trusts them. No one trusts the social democrats. No one trusts the conservatives. And they're losing votes. And these parties have shifted rhetoric to the right to cater to these kind of voters that they're losing. The problem is that this doesn't take the wind out of the far-right movements. It actually creates a space in which they become more widely acceptable. And in this context, we have to be on our guard because fascism today, it's sneaky. I've been reading a guy called Mark L. Thomas, who I'd encourage anyone to look up, for Socialist Worker Party in the UK. And he talks about the masks that fascism wear, right? One mask, legitimacy. They conceal a profoundly anti-worker and anti-democratic agenda with a degree of reasonableness. We're seeing this with Le Pen's party today. In France, they're a party that are literally descended from outright fascism, as I've said, and they're kind of aligning themselves with the values of the French Republic. They're not, they're coming out against anti-Semitism now, and they're masking this kind of more overt anti-Semitism and racism. At the same time, they deny that the French state had anything to do with the Holocaust, which is a form of Holocaust denial. And, it's kind of anti-Semitism light. They are Islamophobic, but they don't even have to go that hard on the Islamophobic rhetoric because the French state is kind of already doing that for them. And in this way, they're using these dog whistles, this kind of covert language to surround themselves with a degree of reasonableness, to make themselves appear like a kind of normal party, kind of like the center-right. The second mask, though, is essential, and that is that these movements disguise a counter-revolutionary movement as revolutionary. The Nazi program talked about opposing big business, finance, international capitalism, and kind of take some of the general anger that is present at the capitalist system in a period of crisis, and turning it internationally. For the Germans, they managed to for the Nazis, they managed to turn it onto international capital, which was then later equated with Jewish people. Today, we have similar kind of, conspiratorial anti-globalist rhetoric, redirecting anger, which should rightly be aimed at neoliberalism, towards migrants, towards vulnerable people in the global south. They're coming for your jobs. They're going to come and devalue your wages. These are all things that we've heard in Canada recently with Pierre Poilievre, right, and other people all over the far right. And in this way, they're reframing a tension that should be between workers and bosses into the national versus the international. There was also street movements, which we've mentioned, and this idea of like paramilitaries. And we have seen these riots in the UK recently, and I won't touch on them too much. But I don't know, maybe like a difference with this is that now these movements seem to be a lot weaker. They're a lot less organized. I think at its height, the SA had over 1 million people in it, and they were all armed. We don't quite see that today. However, I think if we do want to make that strict comparison, we might want to look at, for example, Modi's government in India, given the shocking amount of political violence that is happening there, is one comparison I was thinking of anyway. So anyway, that's all to say that, at best we're getting a period of stagnation and rightward shift, at best. At worst, the beginnings of fascist movement and the incubation of fascist ideas in which the rhetoric of fascism becomes legitimized, emboldened, and therefore more likely. So what do? How do we unmask the fascists and the far right? As Suzanne was saying, fascists with these ideas popped up everywhere in the 1920s. Not all of them succeeded. A lot of this stuff was nipped in the bud. In the bud, and that's because at early stages, fascist movements are vulnerable. They have contradictions. They are fundamentally anti-worker. You know, they're not in favor of they're not working in the favor of these people. And the 1930s also was not a simple, inexorable march of fascism across the globe. It was also a decade of mass working class resistance in lots of places. So I think without coming down too definitively on whether far-right populists are or are not fascists, you know, is Trump a fascist, is Le Pen a fascist, you know, I think we can look back at what happened in the 30s and use these lessons to equip ourselves for the future. And we need to pay attention to what people are doing and what people are saying. You know, when we hear these key things about, you know, social Darwinism, race science, superiority of one people over another, nationalism, the creation of foreign enemies, these are kind of like, these are fascist talking points that are emerging, and we need to be really aware of when it's happening and call them out, because, you know, I think in the 1970s, when people were fighting the National Front in the UK, it was really easy to fight these people because, you know, there's pictures of them in Nazi uniforms. You used to be able to hold up a photo and say, look, here's the fascist, here he is, here they are. And now that's not the case, you know, they're sneaky. And that's why it's really important to have a solid definition of fascism and an understanding of the history of fascism, which is what we're trying to do today, and really do our homework as socialists. You know, if we are going to deny these fascists a platform, which I think we have to be denying them when they offer. You know, we can't just no platform everyone that comes on TV. You know, there's a lot of like right-wing arseholes that go on TV. But I think once you start doing that, you kind of seed the ground to a broader conversation about free speech and this kind of stuff. It's like, no, there are some people who are fascist, and these are the people we really need to be focusing on in our strategies. And just being clear on that is really important. Another strategic decision is to say definitively no allying with the center-right. You know, one response to the rise of the far-right and fascists is to say, let's make a pact with the lesser of two evils. You know, we're seeing that with people saying vote Democrats today instead of Trump. Obviously, from our point of view, that's really silly. You know, these are the people that are brutalizing people on the border. These are the people that are already drowning people in the Mediterranean, right? I think, you know, these are the people that are giving rise to fascism itself. And perhaps more critically, we need to understand that the ruling class, they also have a theory of lesser evil. And for them, the lesser evil is fascism. Liberals in the 30s and today, they're willing to do deals with the far right to stop the left. And we've seen that, and that is something we really need to be aware of, because they would rather see fascism than the left, quite frankly. So, to sum up, we need to build a united front to stop the Nazis. That's one based in trade unions, progressive migrants' rights organizations, workers' organizations. And we have to understand, this is the key point, for all of their millions of votes, we're the majority on the streets. And we've seen this again and again. Palestine demonstrations, climate strikes, anti-racist protests, fighting the right in the UK, pension strikes in France. Again and again, in country after country, we've seen that the left has been able to mobilize vastly bigger numbers than the right. And, you know, we need to win the argument. We need to win people over to our sides, because in a period of crisis, when people are on a knife edge on which side they're going to think is the mass movement that's going to save them, we need to be winning that argument and bringing people over to our side. And I guess this is the reason why we've gathered at this event today.